She was 7 months pregnant, standing in a corridor that smelled like antiseptic and quiet desperation. She had not slept in 31 hours. Her feet ached. Her back screamed. Her ring finger still felt heavy, even though she'd stopped wearing the ring 3 months ago. Grief did that to you. Made you feel the weight of things that were no longer there. She was about to clock out. About to finally go home. About to breathe. And then the elevator opened. And everything in the hospital shifted. Not physically. Not visibly. But the air changed. The way it does when something powerful enters a room. She turned. And she saw him. Kwon Tae-Sung. The man who owned the building she worked in. The man who owned the hospital. The man who, according to the financial papers, owned half of Seoul. And from the look in his eyes, he expected her to bow. She didn't. And that was the beginning of everything. Before we continue, if you love stories about power, love, and the kind of courage that breaks empires, subscribe to the Korean Dawn. This is where danger wears a suit. And love costs everything. Now, let's begin. The date was the 14th of November. A Tuesday. The kind of day that looked ordinary from the outside: gray sky, cold wind biting at the ankles, the city of Seoul moving at its usual ruthless pace. Inside Kwon Medical Center, Floor 9, the oncology ward had been chaotic since 5 in the morning. 2 emergency admissions. 1 code blue that lasted 40 minutes. A family screaming in the corridor because no one had told them the truth fast enough. Nurse Seo Hyun-Ji had handled all of it. Alone, mostly. Because 2 of her colleagues had called in sick. Because the ward director had a board meeting. Because when you were a woman in a white uniform and 7 months pregnant, people assumed you were either about to collapse or that you would carry the weight of everyone who already had. She did both. That was who Hyun-Ji was. 29 years old. For years of nursing. 7 months of pregnancy. 3 months of widowhood. She didn't think about that last word anymore. Widow. It sat in her chest like a stone she'd learned to breathe around. Her husband, Seo Min-Jae, once an accountant, once the kind of man who made her laugh until her ribs hurt, had died in a car accident 4 months ago. At least, that was what they told her. She had no reason to question it. Not yet. At precisely 2:47 in the afternoon, the elevator on floor 9 opened. Security guards emerged first. Then assistants. Then him. Kwon Tae-Sung walked like men walked in movies about men who had never been told no. Tall. Broad-shouldered. Wearing a suit that cost more than Hyun-Ji's monthly salary. Dark eyes scanning the corridor with the casual indifference of a man inspecting property. Which was exactly what he was doing. Because Kwon Medical Center had just been acquired by Kwon Industries, his company, 72 hours ago. He was here for an inspection. A formality, his assistant had called it. To Kwon Tae-Sung, nothing was a formality. Everything was control. He moved down the corridor. Staff froze. Nodded. Smiled nervously. Some bowed deeply. He barely looked at them. Until he reached Station 9B. Until he found the one person not watching him. Hyun-Ji stood at the nurse's station, back turned, updating a patient chart with the focused efficiency of someone who genuinely did not have time for interruptions. His assistant cleared his throat. She didn't move. Nurse. The voice was low. Commanding. Accustomed to immediate response. Hyun-Ji turned not with a jolt, but slowly. The way a person turns when they are finishing a sentence before acknowledging you. She looked at him. Not with awe. Not with fear. With the polite but guarded expression of a woman who had already had the worst year of her life and was not particularly impressed by suits. Can I help you? Something moved across his face. Barely visible. But there. Surprise. You're blocking the inspection route, he said. She glanced down the corridor. It was wide enough for 4 people. I'm updating a patient chart, she said. I'll be done in 30 seconds. A pause. I don't wait. She held his gaze. And said, very calmly, then you're welcome to walk around me. The silence that followed was the kind that senior staff felt in their bones. 2 assistants tensed. 1 security guard shifted. Kwon Tae-Sung stared at her. And for one long, unreadable moment, nobody breathed. Then he walked around her. without a word. But he glanced back once. Just once. As if he was trying to figure out what exactly she was. Word traveled fast in hospitals. By the time the inspection was over and the executive convoy had swept back into the elevator, floor 9 was buzzing. She talked back to him. She didn't even bow. Is she insane? Hyun-Ji heard all of it. Ignored all of it. She had a patient in room 912 who needed a port flush, a family in the waiting area who needed an honest conversation, and feet that had been sending urgent distress signals for the last 6 hours. Kwon Tae-Sung was not her problem. She was wrong about that. The call came the next morning. Director Baek, a lean, perpetually anxious man who had run the hospital for 11 years and had recently developed the nervous habit of straightening his tie every 4 minutes, summoned her to his office. Hyun-Ji arrived on time. Sat down. Waited. I'll be direct, Baek said. He was not looking at her. That was never a good sign. The new ownership group has submitted a restructuring memo. He slid a paper across the desk. Hyun-Ji looked at it. Her name was on it. Seo Hyun-Ji reassignment/contract review. They're citing attitude during an executive inspection, Baek said quietly. Insubordination. The word landed like ice water. I updated a patient chart, she said. I asked him to walk around me. I know. That's insubordination? Baek finally looked at her. And she saw it in his face, not agreement. Resignation. Hyun-Ji SSI. He owns this building. He owns this hospital. He could have this entire ward shut down by Thursday if he wanted to. A pause. He wants you reassigned to night shift in the basement storage clinic. The basement. No patients. No real work. Just a quiet burial for a career. She stared at the paper. She thought of Min-Jae. Of the baby moving slowly inside her. Of everything she had survived in 4 months to keep standing. Then she looked up. No. Baek blinked. What? I won't accept the reassignment. Her voice was steady. I've committed no clinical error. I've violated no professional standard. If he wants to remove me, he can do it in writing with cause, and I will take it to the labor board before the ink is dry. The silence in that office was very long. Baek stared at her. Like a man watching someone walk toward a cliff. He will not like this, he finally said. Hyun-Ji stood. He doesn't have to. She left. But her hands were trembling by the time she reached the stairwell. Not from fear. From the adrenaline of someone who had just said something true and knew the cost was coming. What she didn't know was this. Upstairs, in the temporary executive suite on floor 14, Kwon Tae-Sung received Director Baek's response via text. He read it once. Then, against every expectation his assistant had, he almost smiled. She refused, he said. Yes, sir. He set the phone down. Interesting. He pulled her file that same evening. Not because he wanted to destroy her. Though he could have. He pulled it because in 20 years of building an empire, no one in a white uniform had ever looked at him the way she did. Like he was just a man in the way. Seo Hyun-Ji. 29. Graduated top of her class at Yonsei University School of Nursing. For years at Kwon, exceptional reviews across the board. One commendation for emergency triage during a multi-car accident response. One formal recognition from a patient family she'd sat with for 9 hours during a terminal diagnosis. And then, 4 months ago, a bereavement note. Spouse, Seo Min-Jae. Deceased. Kwon Tae-Sung stared at that line. His assistant stood nearby, waiting. Her husband, Kwon, said quietly. How did he die? Car accident, sir. Outside Mapo District. November record show. Which firm did he work for? A pause. Kwon Industries, sir. Finance division. Junior accounts. The room went very quiet. That night Kwon Tae-Sung did not sleep. He sat in the floor-to-ceiling window of his penthouse and looked out at the city he had spent his life building. And he thought about a dead accountant. And a pregnant nurse who didn't bow. And the way those two facts sat next to each other in his chest like the beginning of something he didn't yet understand. He was not a man prone to guilt. He had built that out of himself long ago. Too expensive. Too slow. Too weak. But something was moving in him tonight. Something unfamiliar. He pushed it down. He was good at that. He ordered the reassignment reversed the next morning. No explanation given. His assistant was too afraid to ask for one. When Hyun-Ji arrived for her shift and found no memo, no basement, no consequence, she was suspicious. She should have been. Because the man who'd tried to bury her was now, quietly, beginning to watch her. And he was very, very good at watching. He came back on a Wednesday. Alone this time. No security. No assistants. No convoy. Just a man in a dark coat, moving through floor 9 like he was trying not to be noticed, which was, for Kwon Tae-Sung, a completely new experience. Hyun-Ji noticed him immediately. She said nothing. Kept working. But her body was aware of him in the way bodies were aware of things that didn't fit, a sound that was slightly wrong, a light that flickered without cause. He stopped at the window at the end of the corridor. Looked out at the city. "You're still here," he said. Without turning. She looked up from her chart. "So are you." He turned then. And for the first time, without the armor of assistants and inspection schedules, she saw his face fully. It was not a soft face. But it was not as hard as she'd expected either. There was something behind his eyes that looked, for just a moment, like exhaustion. Like a man who had been performing for so long he'd forgotten what he looked like at rest. "Why did you refuse the reassignment?" he asked. "Because I did nothing wrong. People who do nothing wrong get reassigned every day in this city. Not by me." A pause. "I didn't take you for someone with pride." She looked at him steadily. "I'm pregnant. My husband is dead. I've been working double shifts for 3 months. A beat. I don't have room for pride. What I have is a standard. And I won't let go of it because a man in a nice suit tells me to." He was quiet for a long time. "What was his name?" Kwon said. The question blindsided her. "My husband." "Yes." She didn't answer immediately. "Min-Jae," she said. His name was Min-Jae. Something crossed Kwon Tae-Sung's face. Brief. Controlled. Buried. "I'm sorry for your loss," he said. It was a formal thing to say. But his voice, just for a moment, was not formal at all. It was the voice of a man who meant it. And that was the most unsettling thing he had done yet. If you're feeling this story, hit subscribe to the Korean Dawn. Drop a comment telling me who you think Kwon Tae-Sung really is. And don't go anywhere, this is just getting started. The Financial Crime Unit had been watching Kwon Tae-Sung for 18 months. Detective Cha Dong-hyun had the kind of face that belonged to a man who drank too much coffee and slept too little, which was accurate. He had a board in his office covered in strings and photographs and numbers that told a story so large, so organized, so deeply embedded in Seoul's infrastructure that he sometimes woke up at 3 in the morning thinking he would never prove it. Kwon Industries wasn't just a company. It was a system. Construction contracts redirected. Medical procurement funds siphoned. Political donations laundered through 3 layers of shell corporations. Billions. Moving in the dark. And the only person who had gotten close enough to document it from the inside had been a junior accountant named Seo Min-Jae, who was now dead. Cha Dong-hyun knocked on Hyun-Ji's apartment door on a Thursday evening. She opened it in her nursing scrubs, hand on her lower back, looking at him with the weary suspicion of a woman who had learned not to trust unexpected knocks. He showed her his badge. She let him in. He sat across from her at a kitchen table that still had 2 chairs pulled out, the way furniture stayed long after the people who used it were gone. "Your husband worked in the finance division at Kwon Industries," Cha said. "Yes." "Did he ever bring work home? Talk about any unusual transactions? Mention documents he'd found?" She was very still. "Why?" He chose his next words carefully. "The accident that killed him, Mrs. Seo. The car that hit him, we found it last month. It was reported stolen 2 days before the accident. Stolen from a parking facility managed by a subsidiary of Kwon Industries." The kitchen was very quiet. "We believe Min-Jae found something," Cha said. "And we believe someone made sure he couldn't share it." Hyun-Ji's hand moved slowly, almost unconsciously, to her stomach. A breath. Then another. "What did he find?" she whispered. "That's what I need your help discovering." That night she sat alone in the dark for a long time. She thought about Min-Jae. About the last week before he died. About how he'd been quiet. How he'd hugged her longer than usual when he left for work. How he'd said, just once, quietly, whatever happens, Hyun-Ji, I need you to know that I did the right thing. She'd laughed and told him he was being dramatic. She hadn't known. She hadn't known. She put her face in her hands. And for the first time since the funeral, she let herself cry. Min-Jae had hidden something. That was the only explanation. Because Min-Jae had been a cautious, careful man, the kind of man who double-checked door locks and kept paper records of everything. Not because he was paranoid. Because he believed in proof. He believed that if something was true, it deserved to be documented. Hyun-Ji searched the apartment that Friday. She started in his desk. Then the bookshelves. Then the kitchen, the closet, the space behind the hot water heater where he used to hide birthday gifts. Nothing. She was about to give up. And then she thought about his coat. The gray wool coat he wore every winter. The one she hadn't been able to bring herself to donate. The one still hanging behind the bedroom door. She reached into the inside pocket. Her fingers closed around something. A USB drive. Small. Black. Labeled in Min-Jae's handwriting, just 2 words. For Hyun-Ji. She called Detective Cha that night. He came within the hour. The drive contained 6 months of hidden documentation. Transaction records. Internal communications. Names. The scope of it was staggering. Medical procurement contracts inflated by 40%, siphoning funds meant for public hospitals. Construction permits purchased through political intermediaries. 3 deaths in the past 2 years, listed in internal memos as resolved complications. And at the top of every chain. Every single one. Kwon Tae-Sung. Cha looked at her carefully. You understand what this means? Yes, she said. He will find out that you have this. His people are inside the police department. I can't guarantee your protection at the institutional level. You would need to. I understand. She didn't feel afraid. She felt something harder than fear. She felt decided. Min-Jae died for this, she said quietly. The least I can do is make sure it meant something. She went to find him herself. Cha had told her not to. She went anyway. Because she needed to look at him. She needed to see his face when she stood in front of him as the widow of the man his empire had killed, and she needed to know, with her own eyes, whether he had known. Whether he had ordered it. Or whether, and this was the thought she hated herself for, he hadn't known at all. His office was on the 41st floor. Glass and steel and silence. She walked past his assistant before the woman could stop her. Pushed open the door. Kwon Tae-Sung looked up from his desk. His expression shifted, not to anger, but to something more complicated. Nurse Seo. Min-Jae, she said. Just the name. Like a blade laid on the table between them. He was very still. Seo Min-Jae, she continued. Junior accountant. Finance division. He found your ledger, didn't he? The real one. The silence was long. Sit down, he said. I'll stand. He looked at her for a moment. Then he stood too. As if, instinctively, sitting while she stood felt wrong. I didn't know who he was, Kwon said. Not until recently. But you knew someone died. A pause. Yes. The word hit her like a hand. His name was Min-Jae, she said. He was 31 years old. He made terrible jokes and he sang in the shower, and he was going to be a father. Her voice was controlled. Barely. And he is dead because of what you built. Kwon Tae-Sung said nothing. She had expected defense. Excuses. Deflection. She had not expected what she saw on his face. Something that looked like reckoning. I know, he said. Quiet. Raw. I know. She left without another word. Because if she'd stayed one more second, she might have believed him. And she couldn't afford that. Not yet. If this story is wrecking you, you're in the right place. Subscribe to the Korean Dawn and drop a comment below. What would you have done in Hyun-Ji's place? Let me know. Now let's keep going. He did not sleep for 2 days. He told himself it was business. Strategy. Risk assessment. Damage control. But at 3 in the morning, in a penthouse that contained every material thing a man could want, and none of the things that actually mattered. He sat with Min-Jae's personnel file and read every page. Academic records. Performance reviews. The commendation from his supervisor, Diligent, precise, trustworthy. A photograph from the employee system. A young man. Ordinary face. Warm eyes. A slight smile, the kind people wore when photos were taken at staff events they didn't mind attending. Kwon Tae-Sung had not ordered the death. He hadn't known the specifics. But he had built a system where men like Director Oh cold, efficient, loyal only to the numbers, made those decisions without asking. He had built a system that ate people. And he had told himself for years that he didn't need to look at what it consumed. He had not always been this. He knew that. There had been a version of him, younger, hungrier, more human, who'd believed that building something powerful was the same as building something good. That if you controlled enough, protected enough, you could bend the world towards something survivable. He'd built the empire for his family. After his father's debt destroyed everything. After his mother worked herself silent. After his younger sister had worn second-hand shoes to school while richer children laughed. He had sworn never again. And he had kept that oath. But somewhere between the first billion and the fourth, the protection had become the thing itself. The power had become the point. And people like Min-Jae had paid for it. He picked up the phone at 4 a.m. Called his head of security. "I want everything on Director O," he said. "Every decision. Every authorization. Every name. Sir. And I want it by morning." He hung up. Sat back in the dark. Thought about a pregnant woman standing in his office, her voice perfectly steady, saying her husband's name like a verdict. He had spent his entire adult life making sure no one could touch him. He hadn't considered that someone might not need to touch him at all. That someone might just make him feel it. Kwon Soo-yeon arrived at Hyun-Ji's apartment without warning on a Sunday morning. She was 26. Small. Sharp-eyed. Carrying a tray of coffee and the expression of a woman on a mission she wasn't entirely sure about. Hyun-Ji opened the door, looked at her and said, "You're his sister." "I am," Soo-yeon said. "And I'm not here for him." They sat at the kitchen table. The one with 2 chairs. Soo-yeon wrapped her hands around her coffee cup and looked at Hyun-Ji with a directness that reminded her, painfully, of something. Of the way Min-Jae had looked when he was about to say something he'd been carrying too long. "I've known for over a year," Soo-yeon said. "About the real ledger. About what some of the board members were doing inside the company." Hyun-Ji stilled. "I didn't know anyone died," she continued. "I swear to you, I didn't know that until last week. But I've been documenting things. Separately. For months. Because I believe what my brother built became something he can't see clearly anymore." She slid an envelope across the table. Hyun-Ji looked at it but didn't touch it. "Why are you here?" she asked. "Because you're the only person who's stood in front of him and told the truth." A pause. "And because that baby deserves a world where the people who hurt its father are held accountable." Silence. "What's in the envelope?" Hyun-Ji asked. Board meeting minutes. Internal communications between Director O and 2 government officials. A paper trail that connects directly to the procurement fraud. Hyun-Ji looked at her. "Your own brother." Soo-yeon's jaw tightened. "I love my brother," she said. "But I won't protect the version of him that lost his way." She held Hyun-Ji's gaze. He would have said the same thing once. "I'm trying to remind him." After she left, Hyun-Ji sat with the envelope for a long time. She thought about trust. About how it arrived in the strangest containers. About how sometimes the people who handed you the weapon were the ones most hoping you'd use it wisely. She added it to what Detective Cha already had. The case was nearly complete. It was the calm before everything broke. 3 days before the evidence was to be submitted formally. Hyun-Ji was working a late shift when she felt it. A tightening. Low. Persistent. Not quite pain. Not yet. She breathed through it. Checked the time. Charted a patient. Breathed again. It happened again 20 minutes later. She called her midwife. "How far apart?" "About 20 minutes. Get to the hospital." The irony was not lost on her that she was already in the hospital. She was admitted to the maternity ward at 10:15 p.m. She called her sister, who lived 40 minutes away. Called Detective Cha, because she was, despite everything, still carrying the drive on her person. She lay in the hospital bed in the quiet, fluorescent calm of the ward and thought about Min-Jae. About how he should have been here. About how he had spent 6 months carefully choosing a name for a baby he would never hold. She put her hand on her stomach. "We're going to be okay," she whispered. Partly to the baby. Partly to herself. Partly to him. What she didn't know was this. Director Oh had learned about the USB drive. He'd learned about Detective Cha. He'd learned about the envelope from Soo-yeon. And he had decided that Seo Hyun-Ji had become too expensive to leave standing. 3 men were on their way to the hospital. Not to the maternity ward. Not yet. But coming. Kwon Tae-Sung's phone rang at 11 p.m. A name he hadn't expected. He picked up. And what his head of security told him, the words moved through him like cold water through a breaking dam. He was in his car before the call ended. We're in the final stretch of the story now. If you haven't subscribed yet, do it. Right now. Because what's coming, you're going to want someone to talk to about it. The Korean Dawn. Subscribe. Now let's go. The maternity ward was quiet. Monitored. Controlled. Hyun-Ji was in early labor, steady, progressing, not yet critical. The nurse attending her, young, gentle, had just stepped out to get a fresh 4 bag. That was when Hyun-Ji heard the voices. Down the corridor. Low. Rapid. The kind that didn't belong. She sat up. Reached for her phone. Called Cha. No answer. Called again. The door opened. Not the nurse. A man she didn't recognize. Dark clothing. Calm face. Wrong. He looked at her. She looked at him. And then, before either of them moved, the corridor outside erupted. Shouting. Running. The sound of a confrontation happening fast and without ceremony. The door swung wide. Kwon Tae-Sung stepped through it. He looked at the man. The man looked at him. Leave, Kwon said. It was not a complicated word. But the way he said it was the voice of a man reminding the room of exactly how much he was capable of. The man left. Hyun-Ji stared at him. Kwon Tae-Sung stood in the doorway of a maternity room in a hospital he owned, slightly out of breath, jaw tight, looking at her with an expression that was entirely unguarded for the first time. "Are you hurt?" he asked. "No," she said. He exhaled. Something vast and relieved. He moved to the chair beside her bed. Sat down. Like a man whose legs had decided that was enough. "Director Oh," he said. "He's been arrested. My head of security had him detained 20 minutes ago. I gave Detective Cha everything. Every record. Every communication." Hyun-Ji was quiet. "Why?" she said. He looked at her. "Because you were right," he said. Simple. No architecture. No strategy. Just words. "I built something that killed your husband. I can't undo that. But I can make sure the people responsible for it face what they deserve." He paused. "Including me." She studied his face. Looking for the performance. The calculation. The angle. She didn't find one. What she found instead was a man who had arrived at the end of something, not the end of his life, but the end of a version of himself he could no longer justify. A contraction moved through her. Long. Rolling. Real. She breathed through it. He stayed completely still, as if he understood instinctively that this was not a moment to move. When it passed, she looked at him. "You should go," she said. He nodded. Stood. And then he did something she had not expected. He bowed. Low. Sincere. The way people bowed in Korea when words were not enough. "I'm sorry," he said. "For Min-Jae. For all of it." He left before she could answer. Her daughter arrived at 4:53 in the morning. Loud. Fierce. Perfect. 7 pounds 2 ounces. A full head of dark hair. Hands curled into small, furious fists. A voice that said clearly, from the very first second, "I am here and I intend to be heard." Hyun-Ji held her against her chest and felt something that had been sealed for months, since the funeral, since the night they'd called her, and she'd had to sit down because her legs stopped working finally, gently, begin to open. Min-Jae would have cried, her sister said from the corner. A laugh. Wet. Real. He would have absolutely cried, Hyun-Ji agreed. She pressed her lips to her daughter's forehead. "His name was Min-Jae," she whispered. "Your father. He was brave. He loved us before he even knew you." Outside the window, Seoul was beginning to lighten. The city quietly waking. Unaware. The way cities always were. The news broke in stages. First, Kwon Industries under investigation. Then, Director Oh arrested on charges of fraud, coercion, and conspiracy. Then, 3 weeks later, the headline no one had expected. Kwon Tae-Sung, CEO of Kwon Industries, surrenders voluntarily to prosecutors. Seoul stopped breathing for a day. The financial world shook. The political structures that had fed on his empire scrambled. Detective Cha stood outside the prosecutor's office and told the assembled press that the case was the result of multiple sources, internal documents, financial records, and the courage of private citizens who had refused to be silenced. He did not name Hyun-Ji. That was how she'd asked it. She watched the coverage from her apartment. Her daughter asleep on her chest. She felt not triumph, not satisfaction. Something quieter and more complicated. The shape of justice, she was learning, was never clean. It didn't fill the space Min-Jae had left. It didn't reverse 4 months of grief. It didn't give her daughter a father. But it meant, with a certainty she could feel in her bones, that his death had not been swallowed by silence. That it had mattered. That he had mattered. And in the absence of everything else, that had to be enough. She named her daughter Han. Grace received. Min-Jae had suggested it once, quietly, in the 3rd month, his hand on her stomach, his voice low and wondering. She'd laughed then. Said it was too pretty. He'd said, "Isn't that the point?" "Han," she whispered to the sleeping baby. "Han it is." She found it 6 weeks after the birth. Slipped under her apartment door in a plain envelope. No name. No return address. Just her handwriting, which she recognized from the one time she'd seen him write something. The note on the reversed reassignment memo. Reversed. That was all he'd written. She'd thought it businesslike. She understood now it might have been more. She sat by the window with Han in the bassinet beside her, and she read. Nurse Seo. I have no right to send this. I'm sending it anyway. I have thought, since the night your daughter was born, about what a person owes the world when they have taken more than they were given. I don't have an answer. I suspect I won't for a long time. What I know is this. Min-Jae was a better man than the ones who surrounded him. He saw clearly. He acted honestly. He paid a price that was never his to pay. I know that words from me cannot repair that. But I want you to know Han will not grow up in a world shaped by what I built. I am cooperating fully with prosecutors. The empire will be restructured. The political network will be exposed. The procurement fraud has been redirected to compensate the public hospitals it stole from. It is not enough. It will never be enough. But it is what I have. I hope Han has your spine. Seoul needs more of it. Kwon Tae-Sung. She read it twice. Set it down. Looked out at the city. She thought about what he was now, not the man in the suit who owned half of Seoul, but a man sitting in the machinery of consequences he had spent years escaping. She thought about what courage looked like when it arrived late. About whether late was the same as too late. She didn't have an answer either. She picked up a pen. She wrote back. Kwon Tae-Sung. Min-Jae used to say, it's not whether you fall that matters. It's what you do when the ground stops moving. Han already has his eyes. I hope you find your way to something worth building. Seo Hyun-Ji. She sealed it. Sent it. Then she picked up her daughter and stood at the window and watched Seoul move below them. Loud. Relentless. Alive. If this story reached you, if you felt Hyun-Ji's grief, or Min-Jae's bravery, or even the slow, painful reckoning of a man who woke up too late, then you understand why we tell these stories. Subscribe to the Korean Dawn. Share this video with someone who needs to hear that standing still in the face of power is its own kind of strength. And now, let's end this. 1 year later. The cherry blossoms had come back to Seoul. They always did. That was the thing about seasons. They didn't wait for human stories to resolve before moving forward. They just continued. Persistently. Quietly. Without asking permission. Kwon Tae-Sung received 2 years of suspended sentence. The prosecutors had pushed for more. His complete cooperation, the records, the names, the voluntary dismantling of 4 shell corporations and 3 political pipelines had weighed heavily in the court's assessment. He did not walk away free. He walked away changed. The company was restructured under an independent board. Soo-yeon, his sister, was appointed to an oversight committee. The procurement funds were redirected publicly, transparently, to the 11 public hospitals that had been shorted over 6 years. It was not a fairy tale ending. There were people who said he got away with it. There were people who said no sentence fit the scope. They were not wrong. But the world had shifted. The system had cracked. Light was getting in. Director O received 8 years. The 2 government officials, 5 and 6. Their names were in every paper. Min-Jae's name was there too. Not as a victim. As a witness. The man who documented the truth before anyone else did. Hyun-Ji went back to work when Hyun was 3 months old. Floor 9. The same ward. She walked into the hospital and the staff at the nurses' station looked up and something happened. Something collective and unspoken, a straightening, a warmth, a "you're back" that didn't need to be said aloud. She set her bag down, pulled on her gloves, got to work. On the table in her apartment, always, was a photograph. Min-Jae at 28 laughing. Head thrown back. Eyes creased. Caught in the middle of something hilarious that no one had written down. Beside it, in a small frame Hyun would grow up looking at. His name was Min-Jae. He was brave. He loved us before he even knew you. She didn't know what happened to Kwon Tae-Sung after the sentencing. She heard, through Soo-yeon, that he had left Seoul for a time. That he had gone somewhere quieter. That he had started, improbably, teaching a financial ethics seminar at a university in Busan. She heard that. And she felt. Not love. Not hate. Something that sat in the complicated space between them. Something that looked, if you tilted your head just right, like acknowledgement. Like, you were a catastrophe, and then you chose differently. That doesn't fix anything. But it's not nothing, either. Hyun took her first steps on a Thursday in March. Wobbling. Fierce. Refusing to fall. Hyun-Ji knelt on the floor in front of her, arms out, tears running down her face, the good kind, the unbearable kind. Watching her daughter cross the impossible distance of 3 feet with the absolute conviction of someone who had no idea that falling was an option. She thought, Min-Jae. She thought, look. She thought, she has your jaw and my stubbornness and somehow, she is perfectly herself. Hyun fell into her arms. Laughed. Wanted to go again immediately. Outside, Seoul moved. Rain began to fall, gentle this time. Quiet. The kind that didn't threaten. The kind that just cleaned things. Washed the streets. Settled the dust. Let the city breathe. Inside the apartment, a mother held her daughter and let herself feel the whole impossible weight of the past year, the grief, the fear, the anger, the unexpected grace of strangers who turned out to have something human left in them. And she let it move through her without flinching. Because that was what you did. You held the grief and the love at the same time and you kept going. Not because it stopped hurting, but because on the other side of the hurt, there was Hyun. There was the morning. There was the first step. There was the next one after that. Min-Jae had been right about one thing. The right thing. It was always worth doing. Even when it cost everything. Even when it cost you. The truth didn't owe you a happy ending. It just owed you itself. And sometimes, that was enough to build a life on. The end. Pushpin channel outro. Soft music fades in. Narrator, calm, warm, unhurried. And that was the story of Seo Hyun-Ji. A woman 7 months pregnant and 31 hours into a shift who stood in a hospital corridor. And didn't bow. Not because she wasn't afraid. But because she knew what she was worth. And she refused to let a man in a suit decide otherwise. If this story moved you, if you felt Min-Jae's courage, Hyun-Ji's fire, or even the slow and painful reckoning of a man arriving too late at his own conscience, then you already know why the Korean Dawn exists. This channel is for stories like this. Stories about power and love and the people brave enough to stand between them. Subscribe. Share this with someone who needs it. And drop a comment below. What would you have done with that USB drive? More stories are coming. Stay with us. The Korean Dawn.